Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating sociological puzzle presented in some recent source material from the John Stossel YouTube channel. We're going to neutrally dive right into the growing appeal of socialism, specifically among a very particular demographic in America. Now, normally, when we think about calls for huge systemic economic changes, we picture the working class, right? But the source material we're looking at today highlights a completely different reality. It argues that the most vocal champions of socialism today aren't the financially struggling, but actually the highly privileged. We're going to walk through the source's arguments, look at modern political figures, historical regimes, and unpack this really interesting psychological concept called luxury beliefs. It's a wildly compelling breakdown of wealth, class, and ideology, so let's just jump right in.
So let's start with this counterintuitive question the source raises. Look, there's an undeniable shift happening right now. People are totally fed up with how expensive life has gotten, and a lot of folks are pointing the finger squarely at capitalism, saying, prices go up and they just never come back down. And for many, the fix is a complete systemic overhaul to socialism. But here's the paradox the source zooms in on. Among Americans aged 18 to 34, socialism is actually viewed more favorably than capitalism right now. Yet, when you look at who is literally out there pushing the hardest for this pro-working class system, it's rarely the actual material poor. Instead, the strongest supporters are relatively well off, which begs the question, why on earth would the wealthy advocate so hard for a system supposedly designed for the working class?
To make sense of this, the source brings in a framework from political psychologist Rob Henderson. And his background is actually super relevant here. Henderson grew up in foster homes before making his way to Yale and Cambridge. Drawing from his own journey across completely different social classes, he coined this term, luxury belief. Basically, a luxury belief is an idea that gives social status to the person holding it, while ultimately inflicting real costs on people who are much less fortunate. The argument here is that, back in the day, the wealthy used to show off their status with luxury goods, think expensive watches or fancy suits. But now they display status through luxury beliefs. These are ideologies that signal, hey, I'm part of the educated elite, but which might actually end up harming the very people they claim they want to help.
To make this concrete, the source applies this theory to something we all remember, the Occupy Wall Street movement. We all know the slogan, we are the 99%. But the source drops a pretty striking demographic reality check about the protesters who were out there camping in the parks all week. The majority of them were actually college educated, and they disproportionately earned over $100,000 a year. The source argues this is literally the perfect example of a luxury belief. I mean, think about it. You have to have a pretty solid cushion of financial privilege to just drop your day job and spend weeks at a political protest, right? The truly poor just don't have that kind of luxury.
And the source uses this to illustrate a really sharp, modern sociological divide. It's almost like a tale of two mindsets. On one hand, you have the college-educated crowd. According to the source, their messaging isn't usually focused on the nitty-gritty of feeding the poor. Instead, they are hyper-focused on closing the wealth gap, basically what the source calls soaking the rich. On the other hand, Americans without college degrees are far more likely to prioritize reducing actual boots-on-the-ground poverty, which the source claims socialism has historically failed to do. It's a really subtle but absolutely crucial distinction, fighting inequality versus fighting actual poverty.
To really hammer this psychological critique home, the source pulls up a quote from former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. She was observing this exact same dynamic decades ago and said they'd rather have the poor poorer, provided the gap were down. The source uses this to make the case that for a lot of elite advocates, the real goal isn't lifting up the bottom at all, it's just tearing down the top. It's like there's this underlying assumption that anyone above you must have cheated to get there, so you focus completely on leveling the playing field, even if it ignores the reality of material poverty.
Section 1. High-profile wealthy advocates. Okay, building on this whole luxury belief theory, the source starts rapidly firing off the backgrounds of some really vocal critics of capitalism, like Bernie Sanders. The source notes he only shifted his rhetoric to target the billionaire class after making millions from a book deal himself, or AOC, who grew up in a wealthy suburb and went to an expensive college. Then there's Seattle socialist mayor Katie Wilson, who went to Oxford debt-free thanks to wealthy parents, and Jemani, who claims capitalist oppression despite growing up in a mansion with Ivy League parents. The overarching theme the source is painting here is pretty clear. These individuals are out there vigorously fighting capitalism, all while personally riding the wave of immense privilege.
And then, the source zeroes in on one of the biggest modern socialist influencers out there, Hassan Piker.
Now, Piker actually admits his dad was an executive at a massive Turkish company. Today, he pulls in millions streaming on Twitch, which ironically is owned by Amazon. The source really highlights this massive juxtaposition, a guy making capitalist millions while constantly bashing the system that pays him. They point to this highly symbolic moment where Piker traveled to Cuba wearing $1,300 designer glasses. The argument here is that this kind of behavior just exposes a deep obsession with status, going to the elite schools, flexing wealth, and flexing the right political beliefs, all while preaching total equality.
But wait, the source makes sure to point out that this isn't just some modern internet-era trend with Twitch streamers. This wealthy mold fits historical socialist icons too. Let's look at Fidel Castro. The source points out that Castro absolutely did not come from the struggling working class. Actually, he grew up on a massive 12,000-hectare sugarcane and cattle farm. He came from serious money. And in a detail that sounds a whole lot like those $1,300 glasses, Castro famously walked around wearing 2 Rolex watches at the same time. He claimed he needed a backup because time was so crucial, but, why did the backup have to be a second Rolex?
And that brings us to the core contradiction the source is trying to expose about socialism's track record. The pitch is obviously super alluring to ordinary people. Free buses, free childcare, half the work week for the same pay, canceling rent and utilities. Who wouldn't want that? But according to the source, if you look at history, it never actually pans out for the working class. The historical reality isn't some fair utopia. It just ends up creating a new class of rich tyrants who dictate how everyone else lives.
So if we take this source's claims about these historical outcomes as true, if the promises consistently flop and just prop up a new elite, we really have to ask, why do people keep falling for it? Why is socialism's appeal actually growing with younger generations right now?
Section 2. The education gap and historical blind spots.
The source points the finger straight at the American education system, and they drop a really striking statistic to back it up. According to their data, your average American high schooler gets about 155 hours of education thoroughly focused on the horrific atrocities of Hitler.
But when we flip over to Stalin, whose communist regime was responsible for absolutely massive atrocities, those same students receive a grand total of 3 minutes of education.
And literally 0 hours are spent on Mao or Pol Pot. Absolutely nothing. 0.
Because of this massive blind spot, the source concludes that socialism is just naturally appealing on a surface level to anyone who hasn't been taught about its catastrophic past. Think about it. You don't really have to train someone into liking the idea of free rent and free services. That sounds fantastic. Instead, the argument is that people have to be actively educated out of liking it. They need to understand the historical dangers and the incredibly high costs of these systems before they get swept up by privileged influencers who will never actually have to pay those costs themselves.
To really ground this, the source shares an amazing first-hand anecdote from a student from Azerbaijan. This is someone who actually grew up in a country that lived through the harsh realities of socialism. They talked about coming to America for college and being in absolute shock to find their campus plastered with communist posters. To someone who actually survived the reality of that system, watching insulated American college kids romanticize it was completely baffling. As the student put it perfectly, I just don't get it.
Which leaves us with this final, really provocative thought to chew on as we wrap up. When we look at the stark contrasts the source presents between the ultra-wealthy influencers pushing these ideologies and the working class folks who historically bear the brunt of the consequences, we have to ask ourselves, are we actually learning the whole truth about these political systems? Or are our worldviews just being shaped by the luxury beliefs of an insulated elite? It's definitely something to think about the next time you hear a millionaire demanding systemic change. Thanks for hanging out with me for this explainer, and definitely keep asking the hard questions.